Hey guys, tonight we drift into a time when the air is thick with candle smoke, the cobblestones are slick after a summer rain, and somewhere in the corner of a creaky tavern, a minstrel strums the same 3 chords you've already heard a dozen times. You can almost hear the weary sigh in his voice, as though even he knows you probably won't survive this endless repetition without nodding off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along behind the minstrel, his lute jangling like loose change in a pocket. He's worn down, not just by the road, but by the weight of his own repertoire. Imagine playing the same tune so often that even your fingers seem to rebel, slipping out of habit, longing for something new. That was the fate of many medieval performers, men who once dazzled courts and marketplaces, but eventually ran out of novelty, condemned to repeat themselves in an age before playlists could shuffle. You notice the faces in the crowd. A knight still in armor, helmet off, eyelids heavy. A baker's boy picking at stale bread. A pair of lovers who use the background drone as an excuse to whisper louder. There's something hypnotic about the sameness, a kind of medieval white noise. Historians still argue whether audiences preferred this familiarity, clinging to songs they knew by heart, or whether boredom gnawed at them just as it does at you now. One mainstream fact sits heavily in this scene. Most minstrels didn't write their own material. They borrowed, reshaped, and handed down melodies through memory, which means the same song could echo across France, England, and Germany, with only the names swapped out. A hero here, a saint there, a moral lesson tucked in like parsley on a plate you didn't order. Yet a quirky detail sneaks through the monotony. Some singers, desperate to hold attention, slipped in oddities, like verses about imaginary animals with more teeth than common sense, or love stories so improbable they bordered on stand-up comedy. These improvisations weren't always welcome, but at least they jolted the drowsy crowd awake for a moment. You hear the lute string snap softly, a tiny rebellion. The minstrel groans, then patches the break with twine, and soldiers on. His audience barely stirs, and in that moment, you sense it, the slow erosion of creativity, the way repetition can dull even the brightest spark. A cycle of comfort and tedium, equal parts lullaby and prison. So here you are, carried by the gentle drone of history, reminded that even centuries ago, people struggled with the tyranny of repetition. And while you may be smiling at the thought of medieval villagers rolling their eyes at yet another tired ballad, don't forget, you're still listening. Still drifting. If that isn't endurance, what is? And if you've made it this far, maybe now's a good moment to gently tap that like button and subscribe. Only if you're finding yourself strangely soothed by this sleepy trail of forgotten tunes. You slip out of that smoky tavern and into the chill of a cobblestoned street. The minstrel's fading notes trailing behind you like the memory of a dream you've already half forgotten. Ahead, the glow of another tavern beckons, a place where the air is thick with hops and sweat, where laughter competes with the creak of stools and the crack of dice cups against battered tables. You push the heavy oak door open and step inside. The crowd greets you not with surprise, but with the familiar. Another minstrel, another lute, Another song you've already heard 3 times tonight, and will likely hear 3 more before dawn. You take a seat by the wall, the wood sticky beneath your fingertips. The room hums with chatter, but every so often it dips, like a wave pulling back from shore, when the singer strums a line so familiar that everyone can join in without thinking. It is communal, yes, but also mechanical. Imagine karaoke without the novelty of neon lights or the possibility of new pop hits. Just the same cycle of tunes, recycled and re-recycled, until they become less performance and more ritual. One mainstream historical truth underpins this monotony. Medieval taverns were central spaces of social life, especially for the lower and middling classes. People gathered not only for ale, but for entertainment, gossip, news, and the occasional fistfight. Music was expected, demanded even, because silence in such spaces felt wrong. Yet the performers rarely brought innovation. Without printing presses widely distributing fresh lyrics until later centuries, songs traveled by memory alone, passed from one performer to another, often losing verses and gaining new ones, like stones smoothed in a river. The repetition might soothe at first, a lull for weary minds after a day of grinding flour or mending shoes. But after the 7th chorus of the same ballad about a knight rescuing a maiden, always described as fair, no matter how tired the rhyme, you begin to notice a peculiar glaze over the audience's faces. They sway, but not with passion. They sway because their bodies are moving just enough to keep from nodding off. Historians still argue whether this sameness was a deliberate comfort, an oral culture clinging to stability, or a symptom of creative drought. Then there's the quirky detail that keeps your ears from shutting entirely. Some taverns solved the problem of monotony by encouraging drinking games tied to the songs. Every time the minstrel sang the word lady, everyone was expected to drink. Every time honor came up, another gulp. This meant that, yes, the songs remained unchanged, but the experience shifted dramatically with every verse. By the end, the crowd might be too drunk to notice whether the minstrel was still singing or had collapsed into his own ale. The solution wasn't variety, it was distraction. You lean back and listen. The singer's fingers pluck the same melody you heard in the last tavern and the one before that. His voice is not bad. It carries across the smoky rafters, but it's thin, worn like an old shoe. He knows the verses by heart, yet you can feel his detachment. He is there to fulfill an obligation. The tavern keeper expects a song, the patrons expect a soundscape, and so he provides. But you also notice the subtle cracks. A verse cut short, a line forgotten, a rhyme twisted into something absurd, because memory falters and ale loosens the tongue. These improvisations sometimes spark laughter, sometimes groans, but they remind you that this performance is not frozen in ink. It lives only in the moment, fragile and transient. You imagine the baker's apprentice in the corner, mouthing along to the words. He has heard this song since he was a boy, maybe even from his grandfather, and so the familiarity comforts him. It is background music to his life, as constant as the tolling of church bells. And yet, you can see the hint of boredom in his eyes, too. He hums not because he is moved, but because silence would be stranger still. The tavern air grows warmer, heavier. Your eyelids lower in sympathy with the room's rhythm. The chorus repeats, again and again, like the pendulum of a clock, steady, numbing, eternal. This is the lull of tavern songs, part hypnotic, part suffocating, a cradle rock that eventually rocks the mind right out of attention. One of the older men at the back bangs the table. He shouts for a different tune, though he knows none will come. The minstrel shrugs, starts again from the beginning. The crowd groans but joins in anyway, because what else is there to do? No one has a fresh story tonight. There is, however, a quiet rebellion you notice. In the corner, a young serving girl sings her own scraps of verses under her breath, mocking the minstrel's lines by twisting them into absurd versions. Instead of "a knight rides boldly," she mutters, "a knight trips loudly." Instead of "the maiden's beauty shines," she sings, "the maiden's shoes don't match." Her whispered parodies are the only spark of originality in the room. And though most don't hear her, you do. You wonder if perhaps, centuries later, someone might remember her sharper wit more fondly than the endless drone of stock ballads. The truth is that medieval tavern music lived in this tension, between the comfort of repetition and the irritation of sameness, between communal bonding and private boredom. The songs were not meant to be art in the modern sense. They were social glue, the background hum of nights that stretched too long, of people who had little else to fill their leisure. The candlelight flickers, the singer drones, and you feel your mind drifting. The boredom is so thick it becomes soothing, like being wrapped in a blanket of predictability. The words wash over you without sticking, like rain against stone. You are lulled, not by beauty, but by monotony itself. And maybe that is the secret. The very repetitiveness that dulled the tavern crowd now works as a gentle hum in your ear, pushing you closer toward sleep. The same chorus, the same verses, the same rhythms. It is tedious, yes, but it is also strangely safe. So you rest your head against the wall, half listening as the song loops yet again. And you know the night is only beginning. The tavern will not quiet until the last candle dies, and the minstrel will sing until his fingers bleed, even if it's the same 3 songs repeated in endless rotation. The monotony does not end here, though. Step outside again, and you'll find that the same cycle echoes not only in taverns, but in the grand halls of noble courts, where repetition wore a different velvet cloak. And that is where your slow walk will take you next. You step from the smoke-thick tavern into the sharper chill of the night, and the air feels almost cleansing, as if it rinses away the clinging drone of that weary chorus. The street is empty, cobblestones glistening under the faint spill of moonlight. Somewhere beyond the market stalls and shuttered homes lies a castle, its towers rising against the dark like silent guardians. You walk toward it slowly, boots tapping in rhythm with your own thoughts, until the heavy gates appear. Passing inside, you find yourself swept into the hush of a great hall where courtiers gather, their silks rustling, their jeweled fingers drumming against polished wood. The scent here is different. Beeswax candles, roasted venison, a faint tang of spiced wine. And here, too, music lingers, though it feels heavier, like perfume applied too thickly. At the front stands another minstrel, his face painted with a smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes, his fingers plucking the lute, as if out of duty rather than delight. You sit quietly among the shadows, observing the nobles. They listen politely, but the rhythm of their sighs betrays a boredom no wine can disguise. A historical fact anchors you here. Noble courts across Europe relied heavily on minstrels and jongleurs for entertainment. These musicians carried not only songs, but also news, stories, and sometimes subtle political messages. To perform well could earn a place at a lord's table, perhaps even a few coins tossed with careless generosity. Yet the songs themselves were often recycled epics of chivalry, the same heroic rescues and moral lessons, repeated until they became as stiff as the tapestries on the walls. You glance at a tapestry now, its threads depicting a knight slaying a dragon, his shield glinting beneath an embroidered sun. Then you hear the minstrel's lyrics. Another night, another dragon, another victory foretold. The overlap between fabric and sound is so complete, you wonder if the entire culture had pressed repeat without realizing. Historians still argue whether this monotony reflected audience demand, nobles craving affirmation of their own ideals, or whether the minstrels themselves lacked permission to innovate, trapped by the expectations of patrons who wanted reassurance, not surprise. And yet, amid the solemn repetition, oddities appear. A quirky tidbit survives in records of court entertainment. Sometimes, minstrels spiced their performances with riddles hidden in songs, little verbal puzzles to test the wit of their audience. You imagine a duke leaning forward, brow furrowed, as the lyrics hint at an answer he cannot find. For a moment, the hall might flicker alive, until the puzzle fades and the chorus returns to its well-worn groove. You watch now as the court slowly fractures into subplots of its own. One lady whispers to her neighbor about the stitching on another's gown. A squire taps his goblet in rhythm, not with interest, but to keep himself awake. A noble yawns openly, his jeweled hand failing to hide it. You realize the performance is less about captivating the audience than maintaining a ritual, a polite backdrop for social display. The minstrel's voice wavers as he reaches the third verse. His song tells of a valiant knight who, against impossible odds, rescues a maiden locked in a tower. The rhyme is neat, the imagery predictable, the applause lukewarm. You picture the same story sung in France, in Italy, in England, each time with only the names changed. A recycled drama passed from one language to another, endlessly repeating like a medieval soap opera rerun. The food cools on the tables. Dogs lie stretched across the floor, tails twitching in dreams more exciting than the song. And you, still lingering in the shadows, feel your mind floating. There is something almost hypnotic in the boredom, a rhythm so constant it becomes a lullaby. You remind yourself gently, you are meant to drift here, to let the sameness ease your thoughts into quiet. But your attention catches on one figure near the dais, a young minstrel, not yet called to perform, clutching his instrument nervously. His lips move as though he's rehearsing something new, a melody, perhaps unfamiliar. You wonder whether he dares to break the cycle, to slip a fresh song into the hall. Would the nobles embrace it, or demand he return to the dragon and the maiden? The risk is real, for patrons could dismiss a minstrel entirely for displeasing them. Yet the hunger in his eyes suggests he longs to try. Another cup is poured. Another sigh escapes. The main minstrel concludes his tale with a flourish that fools no one into thinking it was unique. Polite applause drizzles through the hall, thin as rain. The nobles nod, as though duty is satisfied, and the minstrel bows deeply before retreating into shadow. You can almost hear the relief in his exhale, a man freed temporarily from the obligation of performance. Still, the ritual continues. A herald announces another ballad, another knightly saga, another repetition of the same familiar chord progressions. You imagine the stone walls themselves carrying echoes of centuries of such songs, the very mortar infused with monotony. It is not unpleasant, but it is unchanging, and in its sameness lies a peculiar comfort. A curious thought slips in. Perhaps repetition was not failure, but design. in an age when life itself was harshly unpredictable. War, famine, plague. Maybe the endless retelling of the same heroic tales provided stability, reassurance that at least in song, the knight always triumphed and the maiden always smiled. Yet historians still argue whether audiences embraced this for comfort or tolerated it with quiet resignation. The candles burn lower. A draft stirs the banners above. Another minstrel steps forward, his instrument slightly out of tune. The discord lasts a heartbeat, then he adjusts, and the same melody returns, smooth and familiar. Around you, the courtiers lean back, half listening, half dreaming, their jewels glinting in the dim. The music becomes wallpaper, noticed, acknowledged, but never cherished. Your own thoughts begin to wander, carried by the lilt of repetition. You recall the tavern earlier, its crude drinking games and bawdy parodies. Here in the court, the setting is grander, but the effect is the same. Background noise for human rituals of power and display. The minstrel may bow lower, the lute may be finer, but the song itself, it drones like the tavern chorus, just dressed in velvet. And so you drift further, eyes following the flicker of light across stone, ears catching the soft pluck of strings you no longer care to interpret. The story of another night blurs with the last, and the one before that, until they merge into a single, endless saga, with no beginning and no end. Still, you sense the pull of the night extending onward, beyond this hall. For outside, in villages and fields, songs repeat not in velvet chambers, but in simple gatherings, where memory fades and improvisation fills the gaps. And that is where your wandering feet will carry you next, into the murmuring circles of villagers whose voices falter, but never fall entirely silent. You slip quietly out of the echoing great hall, leaving behind its perfumed boredom and velvet drapery, and you find yourself on a narrow dirt road leading away from the castle. The air here feels fresher, though tinged with the faint smell of damp straw and chimney smoke curling from clustered cottages. Your steps carry you into a village where people gather in the square, wrapped in rough wool, their faces lit not by chandeliers, but by the fire crackling in a crude pit. There is no polished minstrel here, no jeweled patron, only the raw current of memory passed from one mouth to another. You settle near the fire, letting its warmth lick at your hands as voices rise together in song. At first, it feels familiar, almost reassuring. The melody is simple, repeated again and again, as though the tune itself resists complexity. But soon you notice something else. The verses don't quite match. One singer insists the hero fought 3 giants. Another says it was 2. A child pipes in, claiming it was 7, his voice breaking with excitement. The story bends, stretches, and shifts depending on who remembers it, and the song becomes less history and more collective improvisation. A solid historical fact explains this instability. In medieval Europe, most communities relied on oral tradition to preserve their cultural memory. Literacy was limited, manuscripts rare, and so songs and tales carried knowledge, news, and values across generations. But oral tradition is a slippery vessel. Words are forgotten, rhymes altered, details dropped. What was once a noble epic could shrink into a jumble of half-remembered lines within a few retellings. And here lies the strange beauty and the strange boredom of folk memory. You watch as the villagers lean into the chorus, their voices weaving together into a rough harmony. Yet when a verse comes that no one quite remembers, they stumble, pause, Then substitute nonsense rhymes, filling the silence with sounds that fit the tune, if not the story. It's a patchwork of memory and invention, stitched together more from habit than artistry. Historians still argue whether these lapses should be seen as failures of preservation or as creative moments of adaptation, whether the people truly lost the old verses or reshaped them deliberately to suit their present needs. There's a quirky tidbit here too. In some villages, when memory failed too badly, people turned to absurd placeholders, humming nonsense syllables, repeating a single word endlessly, or even imitating animal sounds just to keep the rhythm alive. Imagine a chorus solemnly singing of a knight's bravery, and then, suddenly, breaking into ba, ba, or moo, moo, because no one can recall the next line. The villagers would laugh, but the tune went on. The song mattered less as a narrative, and more as a communal act of togetherness. The fire snaps loudly, a spark spiraling upward, and the circle glows with flushed faces and tired eyes. You sense the way the villagers rely on these songs, not for novelty, but for comfort. Life here is repetitive. Fields plowed, bread baked, taxes collected. A familiar chorus, even with missing pieces, mirrors their own routines. The boredom becomes a balm. You hum along, not because you know the words, but because the tune requires nothing of you but presence. A woman steps forward, her voice carrying the melody for a moment, but she forgets halfway through and laughs, gesturing to another to continue. The next singer adds verses of his own invention. Suddenly, the hero fights not giants but wolves, and the maiden rescued is no longer noble, but a shepherdess. The crowd accepts this casually, not concerned with accuracy. The tale is a living thing, mutating in real time. You realize you are witnessing the erosion of memory and the blossoming of improvisation in the same breath. And yet, the overall mood remains subdued, almost soporific. The same refrain circles back again and again, wrapping the listeners in its predictable rhythm. Even the dogs lying by the fire seem to sway their tails to its cadence. The night wears on, and you feel yourself lulled by the repetition, as though memory's imperfections only add to the drowsy charm. You recall, faintly, the minstrels in the court and tavern, more polished, more constrained. But here in the village, the same fate befalls the songs. Sameness, fading verses, the long sigh of cultural déjà vu. The villagers don't resist it. They lean into it, as though the monotony itself is an old friend. But you can't ignore the tension. The elders frown when the younger ones twist the story, muttering that the real version has been lost. The children giggle, inventing wilder and wilder additions, enjoying the chaos. Between the two generations lies a tug-of-war. Preservation versus invention. Historians still argue whether these tensions shaped the evolution of folklore, or whether the songs simply decayed like fruit, left too long in the sun. The fire burns lower. Someone stirs the embers, and sparks flare briefly. The song loops into its chorus once again, the words patched, the melody intact, the meaning blurred. You drift on its rhythm, half conscious of its banality, half comforted by its persistence. And then, just as your thoughts begin to dissolve into the hum of repetition, a man with a battered drum strikes a beat. It startles the circle for a moment, then pulls them into new energy. But the excitement fades quickly. The beat folds into the same rhythm as before, predictable, relentless, eternal. You realize that here, too, monotony triumphs. Yet it is not despairing monotony. It is the monotony of survival, of a community singing together so they don't feel alone in the vast silence of medieval night. And in that sense, the boredom holds power. It anchors them, and it anchors you in the soft drift toward forgetfulness. As you rest your head against a log, the song blurring into your pulse, you sense that this fading of memory is not the end, but the bridge to another stage. For just as verses vanish from folk memory, so too do instruments falter under the strain of endless sameness. And soon, your wandering feet will follow the weary strings of lutes and harps, worn down by repetition, into another layer of history's slow, soothing drone. The village fire dwindles into soft embers, and the chorus of voices dissolves into murmurs, yawns, and the shuffling of weary feet heading back toward low-roofed cottages. You linger a moment longer, watching smoke coil lazily upward, until even the sparks give way to darkness. Then you rise and follow the sound of strings, thin, metallic, strained, to where another kind of monotony waits. The road bends, the night deepens, and soon you find yourself in the company of a minstrel, whose instrument seems older than his own bones. His lute, once golden, now bears scratches like scars, its strings stretched tight, as if begging for rest. You walk beside him, the rhythm of his strumming uneven, and you realize you're listening not only to music, but to fatigue itself. Each note drops heavily, without flourish, as though played by hands that have repeated the same patterns too many times. The melody has no life of its own. It drags its feet the way a tired traveler drags boots through mud. You picture dozens of such instruments scattered across Europe, in taverns, courts, and village squares, each one echoing the same limited progressions until they blur together into a great medieval hum, endless and unchanging. Here lies a solid historical fact. Medieval minstrels relied mostly on lutes, harps, fiddles, and bagpipes, instruments that were durable, but not infinite. Strings snapped, frames warped, reeds wore out. Craftsmen could repair them, yes, but repeated strain meant repeated weakness. The repertoire itself often accelerated the wear. A harp plucked to the same tune for decades grew hollow, its resonance fading, while a lute string groaned beneath the weight of constant tension. The audience might not notice, but the players did, and with every repair, the instrument lost a little of its original brightness. The minstrel sighs, pauses mid-song, and adjusts a peg. The string creaks in protest. He strums again, but the sound is flat, like a voice that has forgotten how to sing. You glance at him, expecting frustration, but he only shrugs. This, you realize, is his normal. Fatigue is not an accident here. It is the condition of the trade. Historians still argue whether minstrels truly suffered from creative exhaustion, or whether audiences demanded such consistency that variety was impossible. Perhaps the instruments, like their players, were forced into sameness by cultural expectation, not by lack of imagination. Yet monotony sometimes breeds peculiar quirks. A fringe detail survives in scattered accounts. When strings snapped mid-performance, some minstrels strung their lutes with horsehair, sheep gut, or even twisted flax just to keep playing. The result was strange, producing squeaks, groans, and unpredictable tones. Listeners laughed, sometimes mocked, but the show went on. Imagine a knight's grand ballad, underscored by a lute suddenly bleating like a goat. For a few fleeting moments, boredom cracked. though perhaps not in the way the performer intended. You notice the minstrel's hands now, the skin calloused, the nails chipped, every finger bent slightly out of shape from decades of tension. He doesn't complain. He keeps strumming, because silence feels riskier than imperfection. Around you, the road is silent except for his weary notes. They bounce off the hedges, drift into the fields, dissolve into the night air. You follow, lulled not by beauty, but by persistence. Soon, you find a small gathering beneath a tree. 3 travelers huddled around a harp. Its frame leans crooked, one string missing, the rest buzzing faintly with every pluck. They play anyway. The sound is uneven, but it is enough to keep their minds steady after miles of walking. You sit with them, listening as the notes stumble, recover, then stumble again. The harp seems alive in its fatigue, groaning like an old man rising from a chair. And here is the tension that threads through your mind. The instruments themselves echo the lives of those who play them. Farmers repeat their labor daily. Bakers knead the same dough. Smiths hammer the same iron. Why should instruments escape the same fate? Their voices become routine, and in their routine lies the same dull comfort. You close your eyes and hear the pattern more clearly. A lute strikes, a harp replies. Then silence waits for the beat to fall again. It is the rhythm of predictability, the rhythm of history itself, repeating in miniature. And you begin to wonder whether this sameness, this exhaustion, was less a flaw than a mirror. Perhaps the instruments were not failing. Perhaps they were simply reflecting the narrow boundaries of medieval imagination, hemmed in by necessity, by survival. Still, you cannot help but notice the longing. One of the harp players plucks a wild note, bending it into a shriek that startles his companions. They laugh nervously, shake their heads, and pull him back to the pattern. Innovation flickers like a spark, then is smothered by the weight of tradition. You can almost feel the harp sigh, wishing it were allowed to scream just once, instead of murmuring the same tune for decades. The night deepens further. The road narrows into silence again, the travelers dispersing, leaving you with the single minstrel whose lute hangs heavy across his back. He hums now more than he plays, the strings too weary to hold their pitch. You walk alongside him, the quiet more soothing than the sound itself. And you realize that fatigue, instrumental fatigue, creative fatigue, communal fatigue, was not simply a byproduct of medieval music. It was the foundation. Music existed to fill silence, not to surprise. And so the instruments bent under that demand until their very voices dulled. The minstrel finally stops, leans against a tree, and lets his hands fall from the lute. He looks at you, his eyes glazed with the calm of someone who has given himself fully to routine. He does not need applause, nor novelty, nor change. He needs only the reassurance that tomorrow and the day after, he will strum again, and the same notes will echo, and life will continue in its narrow loop. You exhale, feeling the same cycle press gently against you. The fatigue is contagious, but in its weariness, there is safety. No surprises mean no shocks. No novelty means no risk. Only the slow, steady drone of strings that have forgotten passion but remembered endurance. And as you lean back against the tree, eyes drifting closed, the last broken note of the lute fades into the night. You know your journey is not over. The road will soon carry you alongside pilgrims who hum their own tired refrains, repeating the same chants mile after mile, as if monotony were both burden and balm. The minstrel fades into the distance, his weary lute no longer audible, and you find yourself drawn onward by the steady rhythm of footsteps on the road. At first, you think it is your own pace echoing back to you from the hedgerows, but soon the sound swells into a chorus of boots, sandals, and bare feet striking the earth in imperfect unison. You crest a hill and see them, a line of pilgrims stretching as far as your eyes can follow, bent beneath cloaks, carrying staffs, sacks, and tokens of their devotion. You fall into step among them, swept up by the slow river of human persistence. They hum, almost instinctively. A tune rises from the front of the column, wavers through the middle, then lags behind at the rear. It is not new. It has not been new for decades, perhaps centuries. You recognize fragments of the same hymn you heard in the village, and echoes of the same ballad sung in the tavern. Each pilgrim mouths the words differently, some in Latin syllables half understood, others in clumsy vernacular approximations. The effect is both unifying and numbing, a rolling wave of sameness that matches the dragging rhythm of their march. A firm historical fact grounds this moment. Pilgrimage was one of the most common communal experiences of the Middle Ages. From Santiago de Compostela to Canterbury to Rome, tens of thousands of ordinary people trudged along dusty roads, bound by faith, curiosity, or desperation. Music was their companion, a way to mark the miles, to distract from aching feet, and to stitch together a sense of shared purpose. Yet the songs themselves rarely varied. Hymns, chants, and ballads circulated endlessly, each step echoing the same refrain until the road itself seemed to sing. You notice now the pilgrim beside you, a woman with a weathered face, clutching a string of wooden beads. She hums a chant under her breath, lips moving without expression, as though the act is less about meaning and more about rhythm. Behind her, a group of young men belt out the same chorus loudly, grinning, their voices cracking with more enthusiasm than reverence. Ahead, a priest leads a psalm, his voice solemn, though the melody is one you've already heard 4 times this hour. The sameness creates a strange trance, a feeling that time has slowed, or perhaps dissolved entirely. And here, too, monotony wears its dual mask. On one side, it is comfort, the familiar notes that make the road shorter, the endless chorus that assures you you're not alone. On the other side, it is fatigue, the numbing of imagination, the hollowing out of words until they are little more than noise. Historians still argue whether these pilgrim chants were embraced with genuine devotion or endured as an obligation. Perhaps, like prayer itself, the repetition was the point. Weariness transformed into spiritual discipline. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind, one tucked away in travelers' tales. Some pilgrims, desperate to break the monotony, invented parodic versions of holy hymns, replacing sacred words with earthy jokes about food, flatulence, or the miserable state of their feet. These parodies spread quietly, half-hidden, shared only when priests were out of earshot. Imagine trudging 30 miles on blistered heels while singing a hymn rewritten to praise cheese or complain about bedbugs. The humor did not erase the fatigue, but it punctured it long enough to coax laughter from tired throats. The sun shifts overhead, then begins to drop. Shadows stretch long across the road, yet the singing does not stop. It loops like a wheel turning, one verse blurring into the next. You find yourself humming along, your mind detached, your body on autopilot. The chant has become less a song than a bodily function, like breathing. It no longer matters whether the words carry meaning. They have become rhythm, pulse, heartbeat. Still, your wandering attention picks up small cracks in the sameness. A boy's voice breaks mid-verse, producing a squeak that earns muffled laughter. An older pilgrim forgets half a line and replaces it with humming. Another, perhaps distracted by hunger, begins a completely different tune before realizing no one else has joined him. The result is messy, sometimes absurd, yet the crowd corrects itself, sliding back into the familiar chorus as though the road itself demands order. You glance at the landscape, fields stretching endlessly, villages distant, the occasional shrine marking progress. Yet all you hear is the steady refrain, the human need to keep rhythm alive. You wonder whether the stones themselves remember the chants, whether the very dust carries echoes of centuries of the same hymns marching over it. A pilgrim shifts beside you and offers a water skin. You drink, taste leather and river water, and hand it back. He nods but says nothing, returning to the chant. You realize words beyond the hymn have become rare, as though conversation is unnecessary when the music fills every silence. The sameness of the chant has become the language of the journey. And so you trudge, lulled by the droning refrain. Your body aches, but your mind drifts, wandering through the monotony into something softer, dreamlike. The chant is no longer merely sound. It is an environment, a cocoon of voices carrying you forward, whether you wish to move or not. But fatigue creeps in. The pilgrims' voices grow hoarse, some falling silent, others humming faintly. Yet the song persists, limping along on fewer notes, weaker breaths. Even silence cannot defeat it completely. Someone always revives the refrain, unwilling to let the road stretch without its companion. Perhaps you think repetition itself is the pilgrim's shield, the sameness protecting them from despair. The sky deepens into twilight. A few torches are lit. The chant slows, then softens, like a lullaby wrapping the weary travelers. You lie down near the road with them, the earth cool against your back, the stars sharp above. The voices fade into whispers, then snores, but you still feel the rhythm thrumming faintly in your bones. It occurs to you that this was the essence of pilgrim music. Not novelty, not art, but endurance. The songs were never meant to thrill. They were meant to last, mile after mile, step after step, until even the dullest refrain became sacred simply by surviving. Your eyes grow heavy, though you know the road continues tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The pilgrims will wake, lift their packs, and begin the same chant again, because to stop singing would feel like surrender, and you, drifting with them, will hear the monotony stretch across more miles, until the sound itself becomes indistinguishable from the act of walking. And as your thoughts soften, you sense a shift waiting ahead. For while pilgrims endure their chants in motion, guild halls in the cities impose their own sameness, restricting creativity not by fatigue or memory, but by rules written in ink. The monotony of the road will soon lead you to the monotony of regulation, where songs are stifled before they can even begin. The dawn rises pale and slow, mist sliding across the road as the pilgrims stir and prepare themselves for another day of trudging. You drift away from them, letting their chants fade into the distance behind you, and your feet carry you toward the heart of a bustling town. The streets here are louder, filled with carts groaning under grain sacks, apprentices sweeping doorways, and the shouts of merchants hawking their wares. Yet amid the noise, another kind of order hums beneath the surface, a structure hidden in guild halls and regulations, where even songs are measured, weighed, and controlled. You approach one such hall, its stone walls plain but imposing, its doors carved with simple symbols of musical instruments. Inside, the air smells of beeswax and old parchment. Men sit at benches, their cloaks trimmed with modest fur, their expressions stern with self-importance. They are members of a musicians' guild, guardians of tradition, and regulators of creativity. Their voices murmur like buzzing flies, discussing fees, rights, and rules that govern who may perform, where and when. You slip into a corner and listen. The conversation turns quickly to repertoire. One guildsman insists that minstrels within their jurisdiction must sing only approved ballads, those sanctioned for moral content and traditional structure. Another nods, adding that variety invites disorder, that too much novelty weakens the dignity of their craft. You hear them mention fines for unapproved songs, penalties for wandering performers who slip in bawdy verses or foreign melodies. The rules are clear. Sameness is safety. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Across Europe, especially from the 13th century onward, guilds regulated musicianship just as they regulated other crafts. In towns and cities, membership determined legitimacy. A guild minstrel had protection, recognition, and access to paid work. But at the cost of freedom, those outside the guild faced suspicion, sometimes even expulsion. What audiences heard was shaped not only by memory and fatigue, but also by deliberate control. The irony hums in your ears. Here are men who claim to safeguard music, yet their very rules flatten it into monotony. Their lists of acceptable songs repeat with little variation. Any spark of invention risks disapproval. Historians still argue whether guilds preserved essential cultural memory or suffocated it beneath layers of bureaucracy. Were they defenders of quality or wardens of stagnation? You notice one young member shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His fingers drum silently on the table, perhaps tracing a rhythm not listed in the guild's catalog. He glances at his elders, hesitates, then falls still. You imagine the melody dying in his throat before it ever reaches an audience, silenced not by fatigue or fading memory, but by regulation. Still, quirky details surface, even within such stifling order. In some towns, guilds required musicians to learn entire repertoires of model songs by rote before they could perform publicly. Examiners listened closely, marking errors like schoolmasters. Candidates who failed had to try again or abandon the trade altogether. Imagine the absurdity. A weary apprentice spending weeks memorizing every verse of a song no one truly enjoyed, simply to earn permission to bore people legally. Some accounts even mention guildsmen deliberately planting mistakes during examinations, testing whether novices could recognize the official version. Back in the hall, the discussion drags on. You hear mentions of seasonal fees, rules about who may perform at weddings, and prohibitions against wandering foreigners, stealing attention with unfamiliar tunes. The logic is clear. Keep control, preserve order, maintain predictability. Yet you sense the underlying fear that novelty could expose their own monotony. You leave the guild hall and step back into the noisy street. Now the monotony feels heavier, because you know it is not accidental. Every minstrel here, strumming in taverns or at market corners, is tethered to rules that punish deviation, The very fabric of music has been bound by invisible chains. The sameness is systemic. You watch a group of guild-approved performers setting up in the marketplace. Their lutes are polished, their clothes neat, their manner stiff. They launch into a ballad you recognize instantly, one that has echoed in every hall, tavern, and village you've visited. Their voices blend smoothly, the rhythm flawless. Yet the crowd barely listens. Some children yawn. A baker wipes his hands on his apron and mutters that he's heard it too many times. The perfection is sterile. And here, the fatigue feels different. It is not the exhaustion of instruments wearing down or memories failing. It is the exhaustion of uniformity, imposed from above. You see it in the performers' faces, too. Their smiles practiced, their eyes distant, their songs performed not for joy, but for obligation. The sameness clings to the square like dust. Still, tiny cracks appear. One singer hesitates on a line, slips in an extra syllable, and hides a grin. Another adds a faint flourish on the lute, a ripple that briefly brightens the melody before smoothing back into the approved version. These subtle rebellions flash and vanish, too small for guild enforcers to punish, but enough to remind you that even within rules, humans itch for variation. The marketplace churns on. The crowd disperses, carrying baskets of bread and bolts of cloth. The musicians finish, pack up, and march stiffly toward another assignment. You remain, listening to the silence they leave behind. It is almost more soothing than the song itself, because at least silence is honest. And you think again about the nature of boredom in this age. Perhaps sameness was not just tolerated, but demanded. The guild supplied predictability, and predictability provided comfort. A bride knew what verses would be sung at her wedding. A lord knew what tune would accompany his feast. And a crowd knew what ballad would drift through the market square. The monotony was security. But as you stand alone in the square, you also feel the cost. The spark of invention is rare, the thrill of surprise nearly absent. You recall the pilgrims parodying hymns in whispers, the villagers humming nonsense to patch missing lines, the tavern girls mocking the nightly ballads. Creativity survived only in margins, never at the center. The guilds had built walls to protect tradition, but those walls kept inspiration locked outside. The day fades, shadows stretching across the cobbles. Guild bells ring faintly in the distance, marking the close of another regulated afternoon. You take one last look at the empty square, then turn your steps toward the edge of town. For beyond these walls, another force weighs heavily on music. Not guilds this time, but the church itself. Its censors, its sermons, its quiet bands that strip songs of their mischief, will shape the next layer of monotony awaiting you on the road. The cobblestone streets of the guild town fade behind you as the bells toll the evening hours. Your steps carry you down a narrow road lined with hedges, and then into open fields, where the air is cooler and filled with the faint sweetness of hay, drying in barns. Ahead, you see the spire of a church cutting the horizon, its pointed silhouette glowing faintly in the last light of the sun. You draw closer, hearing the low murmur of evening prayers drifting through the heavy stone walls. For a moment, you imagine this might be a refuge from monotony, a place where music might rise with celestial freshness. Yet when you slip inside, what you discover is not freedom, but another form of sameness. This time enforced not by guilds, but by the church itself. The nave is dim, candles guttering against high arches. A choir of boys stands near the altar, their voices weaving a chant that is steady, solemn, and unmistakably repetitive. The melody moves like a slow tide, rising and falling with little variation, each phrase almost identical to the one before. At first, the sound soothes, its predictability calming your restless mind. But after the 5th repetition, and then the 10th, you realize that the sameness is not accidental. It is doctrine. A mainstream historical fact anchors this experience. The medieval church exerted immense control over music, shaping not only what was sung within sacred spaces, but also what could be sung outside of them. Gregorian chant, with its restrained and formulaic structure, dominated church services for centuries. Variation was discouraged, embellishment frowned upon, and the emphasis lay on unity, clarity, and discipline. Songs outside the church walls, particularly those with bawdy humor or satirical bite, were often condemned, censored, or outright banned. You watch the choir master frown as one boy hesitates, accidentally adding a small flourish to a line. The correction is immediate and sharp. The note must be flat, unembellished, exactly as tradition demands. The boy nods quickly, red-faced, and resumes his role in the endless tide of monotone devotion. You feel sympathy, knowing he may repeat this chant every evening of his youth until the notes blur into muscle memory. And here lies the dullness sharpened by authority. In taverns and villages, monotony arose from memory lapses or fatigue. But here in the church, monotony is cultivated deliberately, a tool of control. Historians still argue whether the uniformity of church music was meant to elevate the spirit through discipline or simply to stifle local creativity that might have wandered into heresy. Perhaps it was both. The repetition made worshippers docile, but it also bound them together in a single voice. Still, quirks crept in, often unintentionally. A quirky tidbit survives in scattered manuscripts, noting that monks sometimes slipped secular melodies into chants, hidden beneath layers of Latin text. A hymn might secretly carry the tune of a drinking song, transformed into sanctity by new words. To an untrained ear, it was pure devotion. To the mischievous monk, it was a private rebellion, a wink across centuries reminding you that even the most regulated music could never be fully tamed. The priest now addresses the congregation. He reminds them sternly that secular songs filled with jokes or desire lead the soul astray. You picture tavern girls giggling at bawdy refrains, then imagine clerics shaking their heads in disapproval. It is not enough to control what is sung in church. The censors extend their reach outward, trimming away verses that are too earthy, too daring, too alive. The result is an environment where songs lose their spice, stripped to bland moral lessons or spiritual platitudes. The effect on the people is visible even here. Parishioners shuffle, eyes half-lidded, their lips moving mechanically with the choir. The chant has become a backdrop, a sonic wallpaper for ritual. Its power lies not in captivating them, but in enveloping them, subduing their restlessness until the service ends. You find yourself caught too, swaying slightly with the rhythm, lulled by the endless cycle of sameness. And yet you sense the loss. You remember the villagers humming nonsense, the pilgrims parodying hymns, the tavern girls mocking nightly epics. Those moments, for all their absurdity, contained sparks of originality. Here, those sparks are smothered before they can ignite. The sameness may soothe, but it also empties. The service concludes, but the monotony lingers. Outside, the bells toll again, their notes as repetitive as the chants within. You watch parishioners file into the dark, silent except for the crunch of gravel under their feet. Perhaps some will whisper forbidden songs in their homes, but none dare sing them here. You wander further into the church, finding yourself in the scriptorium, where monks bend over parchment, copying lines of chant notation. The room smells of ink and parchment dust. The notes etched on the page are square and rigid, marching in orderly rows with no sign of playfulness. The monk nearest you pauses, flexes cramped fingers, then resumes copying. His work is not creation, but replication, and you realize that even the act of writing music has become a ritual of monotony. Yet even here, humanity slips through. In the margin of one manuscript, you notice a doodle, a rabbit playing a harp, ears drooping comically. Another page hides a grotesque face, sticking its tongue out at the holy text. These tiny drawings are the rebellion of bored scribes, a reminder that creativity cannot be wholly erased, even under the weight of doctrine. You step outside at last, the cool night wrapping around you like a cloak. The stars burn faintly overhead, but their light feels distant compared to the drone of chant still echoing in your ears. The church, with all its authority, has added another layer of sameness to the world of medieval song, stripping away mischief and delight until only solemn repetition remains, and you feel yourself drifting in sympathy with those parishioners, lulled by sameness, dulled by discipline. Perhaps that was always the point, not to thrill, not to inspire, but to soothe the restless heart into submission. The chants were less about music than about control. Your path leads onward again. Behind you, the bells fall silent. Ahead, you hear the faint sound of another chorus, this one not holy, but political. For beyond church censors, another force harnesses repetition for its own ends. The rulers who turn music into propaganda, recycling patriotic tunes until no one dares to clap. Yet no one dares to stay silent either. You leave the shadow of the church behind, the stone walls shrinking into the distance as you follow the road into a town square where banners hang limp in the still air. The square is filled with people, though their energy feels muted, as though they are waiting for something they already know too well. At the center, a platform has been erected, draped with the colors of the local lord. Musicians stand ready, their lutes tuned, their drums tightened, their voices prepared not for art, but for duty. You take a place at the edge of the crowd and wait with them, feeling the hush before the inevitable. The trumpets sound. The same fanfare you've heard in other towns as blares across the cobbles, identical in rhythm and tone, as though written by one hand and endlessly duplicated. Then the chorus begins, a patriotic ditty praising the valor of the ruler, the prosperity of the land, and the endless loyalty of its people. The crowd joins in reluctantly, their mouths moving, their voices thin. The lyrics are familiar, painfully so. They have been sung at every festival, every proclamation, every triumphal entry. You can almost predict the next line before it leaves their lips. Here is a solid historical fact. Medieval rulers and dormouse frequently used music as propaganda. Ballads and hymns celebrated victories, praised dynasties, and reinforced loyalty to crown or city. Troubadours and minstrels were sometimes commissioned specifically to spread political messages, carrying songs from town to town as living news broadcasts. But repetition dulled the edge. What began as stirring anthems soon collapsed into weary choruses, performed not with passion, but with resignation. The crowd shifts, uncomfortable. A farmer yawns and scratches his beard. A mother hushes her child, who squirms at the monotony. Even the musicians look weary. Their eyes glazed as they strum the same chords they have strummed 1,000 times before. You hear faint mutters ripple through the people. They are not defiant, only tired. The propaganda has lost its bite, reduced to background noise. And yet, the authorities demand performance. Soldiers stand nearby, eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring participation. You notice how everyone sings, even if softly, even if reluctantly. To stay silent would be to draw attention, and attention could be dangerous. Historians still argue whether such music genuinely inspired loyalty or merely created the illusion of unity, enforced by fear and fatigue. Perhaps the song succeeded only in making obedience visible, not heartfelt. Quirky details surface even in this bleak monotony. Some chroniclers tell of towns where children mocked propaganda songs by twisting the lyrics into absurd parodies. A ballad praising a king's bravery might be transformed into a jingle about his smelly boots or clumsy horse. These jokes spread quietly, whispered in alleys, sung softly in kitchens, until even the most loyal citizen could not hear the official version without smirking. The authorities tried to suppress these mockeries, but like weeds, they sprouted endlessly. In some ways, parody became the only form of freshness in a landscape otherwise smothered by repetition. Back on the platform, the musicians reach the chorus again, their voices straining to sound triumphant. The crowd claps dutifully, the sound thin and unconvincing. You imagine how many times this same performance has unfolded across the realm, in markets, in squares, in festivals. The monotony is not an accident. It is the strategy. Repetition drills the message deeper, whether anyone believes it or not. Yet you feel the weight of it pressing down. The song drones on, and your mind begins to wander. You imagine the same tune echoing across Europe, reshaped to praise different rulers, but retaining the same structure. Kings, dukes, and mayors, all recycling the same propaganda melodies, confident that familiarity will breed loyalty rather than contempt. But here, watching the villagers fidget and sigh, you sense that the effect is closer to sedation. The sameness numbs rather than inspires. One of the drummers slips, his beat lagging for a moment. The mistake startles the crowd awake, and you notice smiles flicker across a few faces. The soldiers do not react, but the tension is palpable. The audience almost relishes the error because it breaks the monotony. Yet the drummer quickly corrects himself, and the sameness resumes. The sighs return, and the square sinks back into half-conscious obedience. As the anthem grinds on, you look around. Banners flap weakly in the evening breeze. Dogs wander between legs, unbothered by human rituals. A boy kicks at stones, mouthing the words with exaggerated boredom. The sameness of the performance has become a mirror, reflecting the weary apathy of the people it claims to inspire. Still, you cannot entirely dismiss its power. There is a strange comfort in predictability, even when it is dull. The villagers may not feel devotion, but they know what is expected, and meeting that expectation shields them from trouble. In a world where war and famine lurk at every edge, the sameness of propaganda songs provides at least one certainty. The king may disappoint, but the chorus never changes. The musicians finally reach the end, drawing out the last triumphant note. The applause rises, dutiful and brief. A herald steps forward to proclaim the ruler's glory once more, repeating the same phrases that echoed at the beginning. The loop is complete. You realize the entire event is designed less as entertainment than as ritual, a performance of loyalty that pacifies rather than excites. You walk away slowly, the chorus still ringing in your ears. It is not beautiful, not stirring, but it clings stubbornly, as propaganda is designed to do. The sameness haunts you, as though repetition itself were the true ruler, stronger than any king. And yet you sense that this monotony is fragile. The villagers' mutters, the children's parodies, the drummer's slip, all hints that sameness cannot fully suppress the human urge for variety. You wonder how long such propaganda can sustain itself before apathy rots it from within. The square empties. Torches burn low. The banners ripple faintly, their colors dull in the fading light. You turn down a side street, leaving the soldiers to pack away their platform and the musicians to count their meager pay. The propaganda anthem lingers in your mind like a ghost, but already it begins to blur with every other chorus you've heard on this journey. Ahead lies a different kind of monotony, less political, but no less wearying. For beyond propaganda lies the struggle of translation, where songs carried across borders lose their shape, their meaning, and their soul. You will soon find yourself among strangers singing familiar tunes in unfamiliar tongues, where repetition breeds not only boredom, but confusion. You step away from the town square, where the last echoes of the patriotic chorus fade like smoke after a torch has gone out. The air feels lighter once you leave the banners and drums behind, but your ears are still ringing with the sameness. The road leads you into another market town, smaller, quieter, but filled with voices speaking in accents you do not quite recognize. Stalls line the streets, their wares draped in cloths of foreign weave, spices glinting in the sunlight, coins clattering in unfamiliar hands. Here, you notice something different. Songs drifting from corners, sung not in one tongue, but in many, like overlapping ripples on a pond. You pause, listening. The tunes are familiar, but the words are not. At first, it seems refreshing. A ballad you have already heard a dozen times takes on a new rhythm when sung in French instead of English. The vowels stretch differently. The consonants snap in unfamiliar places. Yet the novelty fades quickly. The song's structure remains the same, the story the same, and the translation clumsy. Rhymes that once fit neatly unravel in the foreign tongue, leaving awkward pauses or forced substitutions. You sense the singers struggling, bending language into shapes it resists. The result is less music than puzzle. A mainstream historical fact gives context. As minstrels and troubadours traveled across Europe, their songs inevitably crossed linguistic boundaries. Verses written in one language were adapted into another, but translation often warped rhythm, rhyme, and meaning. A French chanson rendered into German might lose its subtle wordplay. An English ballad sung in Italian could sound strained, its cadences ill-suited to the new tongue. Yet the song spread anyway, because audiences craved familiarity, even at the expense of clarity. You lean closer to one group of travelers, singing by a fountain. They perform the tale of a knight's bravery, but half the words are borrowed from Latin, sprinkled into the vernacular like mismatched spices. The melody survives, but the meaning stumbles. You glance at the listeners. Some nod along, some look confused, and a few laugh at the absurdity. The song continues, carried more by memory of rhythm than by understanding of words. And this is where boredom seeps in. The translation preserves the shell, but loses the spirit. You recognize the melody instantly, and though the words are technically new, the sameness overwhelms. It is like hearing the same joke told badly in another language. The punchline remains, but the charm vanishes. Historians still argue whether this spread of translated songs enriched medieval culture by creating shared traditions or diluted it into a bland stew of half-understood refrains. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your memory. Some translations went so poorly that singers replaced entire verses with nonsense syllables, convincing listeners it was foreign poetry. People nodded solemnly, believing they were hearing deep wisdom, when in fact, the minstrel was humming gibberish because he didn't know the language. The audience, unfamiliar with the original, accepted the charade. Thus, boredom disguised itself as sophistication, and no one dared admit the emperor had no clothes. You drift further into the market square, where another group of merchants gathers. They sing a hymn learned on pilgrimage, originally composed in Latin, but now mangled into the local dialect. Each syllable drags, forced to fit the melody's rigid frame. The audience listens politely, but their faces reveal little enthusiasm. You realize that translation has not solved the problem of repetition. It has only painted it in new colors, slightly brighter but still familiar. Children play nearby, mocking the singers by twisting the foreign words into comic imitations. They repeat odd syllables exaggeratedly, giggling as they transform the solemn chant into nonsense. Their laughter rings fresher than the song itself, though it too becomes repetitive as they echo the same joke again and again. Even parody cannot escape the cycle. The marketplace hums with barter, the sound of coins exchanged, goats bleating, merchants shouting. Yet beneath it all, the songs repeat like a slow heartbeat, looping endlessly, their meaning diminished with every mistranslated verse. You sense the fatigue in the singer's shoulders, the resignation in their eyes. They know the songs are clumsy, but they cling to them anyway, because silence would feel stranger still. A foreign merchant beside you murmurs that he has heard this ballad in his homeland too, though with different names, different places. He shrugs, unimpressed. To him, the song is as predictable as the rising sun. You realize that this sameness stretched across borders, a monotony that united Europe, not through brilliance, but through shared fatigue. You walk further, leaving the square behind, and find a group of travelers resting beneath an archway. They strum a lute softly, their voices weaving together. The tune is once again familiar, but the words blur between languages, half French, half Latin, with stray English phrases clinging stubbornly to the chorus. It sounds almost comical, like a quilt stitched from scraps of mismatched cloth. Yet the travelers sing earnestly, unaware of the absurdity. You cannot help but smile, though your smile fades quickly when the monotony lulls you again. And here is the heart of it. Translation, meant to refresh, often deepened the weariness. Instead of novelty, it produced awkwardness. Instead of clarity, confusion. Yet the cycle continued. Because people preferred the dullness of the familiar to the silence of the unknown. Historians still argue whether this was cultural unity or cultural stagnation. You sense it was both, a shared boredom masquerading as tradition. The sun dips lower, shadows lengthening across the streets. Merchants pack their wares. Travelers gather their cloaks. Singers fall silent one by one. But the echoes remain, layered in your ears. The same ballad in 3 languages. None of them graceful, all of them weary. You realize that translation did not rescue these songs. It only stretched them thinner, like watered wine. You pause at the edge of town, glancing back. The banners of the market flap softly, the air heavy with the scent of spices and livestock. Somewhere behind the walls, another group begins to sing, their voices faint, but unmistakably repeating the same refrain. You know it will spread again, to another town, in another tongue. Each version slightly different, none truly new. And as you turn toward the open road once more, you feel the weight of this monotony settle deeper. The sameness has no borders. It travels as freely as the minstrels themselves, reshaping, but never renewing. Even across languages, the drone persists. Ahead, faint music drifts on the wind, louder with each step. You sense the pull of a festival, where crowds gather not for translation but for celebration. Yet celebration, too, has its repetitions, its endless cycles of familiar songs echoing across fields. The monotony will not end here. It only shifts into another costume, brighter, but no less weary. The market town fades behind you, its mismatched syllables dissolving into the hum of evening. The road widens, and soon you hear the low throb of drums, the ring of laughter, and the shrill squeal of pipes drifting across the open fields. You follow the sound, your feet guided by the rhythm, until you crest a hill and look down on a meadow alive with torches and stalls. It is a festival, sprawling and bright, a temporary village built of tents, banners, and makeshift stages. You smile faintly, expecting a burst of variety, perhaps some spark of freshness. But as you descend into the crowd, the reality settles in. The sameness has arrived here too, disguised in celebration. The first stage you pass is crowded with dancers. They stamp their feet to the beat of a drum, their skirts whirling, their boots thudding in practiced unison. The tune is familiar, painfully so. It is the same melody you heard in the tavern, the court, the village square, dressed up with more percussion, but essentially unchanged. The crowd claps along, some with genuine joy, others with a look that says they could clap this way in their sleep. A mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. Medieval festivals were the backbone of community life, tied to religious calendars, agricultural cycles, and civic pride. Music was everywhere, on stages, in streets, at dancing circles, but the repertoire was limited. Familiar ballads, hymns, and dance tunes dominated. Novelty was rare, because repetition ensured participation. Everyone knew the steps, the words, the rhythm, but the very accessibility that made festivals joyous also smothered originality. You push through the throng, drawn by the smell of roasted meat and the tang of spilled ale. Another stage rises ahead, this one with jugglers and a fiddler providing accompaniment. The fiddler saws furiously at his strings, but you recognize the melody instantly. It is a jig you've already heard 3 times tonight, performed with the same predictable flourishes. The jugglers toss torches, their timing exact, their movements rehearsed. The crowd cheers politely, though their eyes wander. The music fills the silence, but it does not ignite the air. And here, you notice something striking. Repetition at festivals is not accidental, but ritualized. The same tunes reappear because they are bound to the very identity of the event. Certain songs mark certain moments, processions, dances, blessings. To omit them would feel sacrilegious. Historians still argue whether this ritual repetition reinforced communal unity or drained festivals of creative spark. Perhaps it did both, welding people together through shared memory while dulling the possibility of invention. Yet quirks break through occasionally. A quirky tidbit drifts from the corner where a small band of mischief makers has gathered. They play the same festival tune, but on makeshift instruments. Pots, pans, and even pig bones rattled together. Their parody draws laughter, and for a moment the monotony cracks. But even their joke depends on familiarity. It works only because everyone knows the tune so well that its absurd reinvention becomes instantly funny. Without the repetition, there would be no parody. The festival swirls around you, vendors shouting, children chasing each other with sticks, drunk men swaying to the music. Yet the sound is strangely uniform. No matter which direction you turn, the melodies blend together into a single drone. Flutes pipe, drums beat, fiddles scrape, but the repertoire loops endlessly. A chorus here mirrors a chorus there. A verse repeated in one corner echoes in another. It is as though the entire meadow has become one giant instrument, strumming the same tired chords. You pause at a booth where a storyteller performs. He recites a ballad you recognize, his hands gesturing dramatically. The crowd leans in, though half of them know the story already. The knight wins. The maiden smiles. The ending is inevitable. Some listeners mouth the words along with him, like participants in a play they have seen too many times. The comfort is real, but so is the boredom. As the night deepens, torches flare brighter, but the songs remain unchanged. Everywhere you turn, the same refrains rise and fall, louder or softer, but never different. You feel lulled, as though the festival itself is a lullaby, disguised in merriment. The monotony seeps into your bones until the noise becomes silence of another kind. You drift past a circle of dancers, their hands linked, their feet pounding in time. The pattern repeats endlessly. 3 steps left, 3 steps right. A spin, a clap. The music loops, the dancers loop, the night loops. You wonder whether the festival is less a celebration of life than a ritual rehearsal of sameness, a performance of community that thrives precisely because nothing changes. Still, fatigue gnaws at you. The fiddles squeak, the drums thud, the voices chant, and the novelty you hoped for never arrives. Historians still argue whether medieval people found these repetitions exciting, comforting, or dull. You sense that the answer lies in all three. The joy of the crowd is real, but it is built on familiarity, not surprise. The monotony becomes its own form of entertainment, because predictability allows the mind to drift while the body joins in. You retreat to the edge of the meadow, sitting on a grassy rise overlooking the torches and tents. From a distance, the sounds blur into one steady hum, like a swarm of bees buzzing in the dark. It is almost soothing now, stripped of detail. The festival no longer feels chaotic. It feels like a single, long-held note vibrating through the night. And yet, you cannot shake the thought that the sameness here will soon extend even further. For in the coming years, with the rise of printing presses and broadsides, these repeated songs will no longer rely solely on memory or ritual. They will be captured on sheets, multiplied endlessly, and distributed until every town hums the same refrains with even greater intensity. You stand once more, brushing grass from your cloak, and turn away from the meadow. The festival behind you glows like a lantern in the night, but its music is already fading in your mind, blending into every other refrain you've heard along this weary journey. Ahead, the faint glimmer of another town beckons, and with it, the whisper of broadsides waiting to be printed, sold, and sung. The monotony will not end here. It will only be pressed in ink, stamped into permanence, and spread across villages like pollen on the wind. And you, weary traveler, will soon find yourself face to face with songs multiplied until their sameness becomes impossible to escape. You leave the fading glow of the festival behind, your ears still filled with its buzzing hum, and step onto the road that winds toward the next town. The night air is cool, carrying the faint scent of smoke and damp earth, and in the distance, you see the flicker of lanterns swaying above market stalls. As you approach, you hear a new kind of chorus, not the live strum of lutes or the droning of fiddles, but the crisp call of sellers hawking sheets of paper. Voices rise above the crowd. Fresh ballads, new songs, the latest verses from the city. You push through the throng and find yourself at the center of a bustling trade, not in cloth or grain, but in words. Broadsides are pinned to stalls, fluttering in the breeze, each one promising novelty, but delivering only more repetition. Here is a firm historical fact. With the spread of printing in the late 15th century, songs once carried solely by memory were suddenly fixed in ink. Cheap broadsides, single sheets sold in markets, flooded towns with lyrics to popular ballads. They promised accessibility, but they also amplified sameness. A single tune, once limited by the frailty of memory, could now be replicated endlessly, sung in every market square, from London to Lisbon. You pick up a sheet. The ink smudges your fingers, the lines clumsily set in uneven type. The words describe a knight's valor in battle. Again, you sigh, recognizing the story you've heard in taverns, courts, and festivals. But now it is frozen on paper, no longer bending or fading through memory, no longer reshaped by village tongues. It is identical in every copy, multiplied until freshness becomes impossible. The very invention that promised variety has ensured monotony on a larger scale. The crowd presses closer. A woman buys a sheet and begins singing aloud. Others join in immediately, reading the words in perfect unison. Their voices rise, strong, but mechanical, like gears in a machine. You realize you are hearing the future of music, not the living improvisation of oral tradition, but the deadening uniformity of mass reproduction. Historians still argue whether the printing of ballads democratized culture by making songs available to all, or whether it flattened culture by drowning it in sameness. Perhaps it was both. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Some broadsides were printed with intentional errors, misspelled words, missing verses, even jumbled lines, because printers rushed to meet demand. Singers, faced with nonsense, simply invented filler rhymes to keep the tune going. Imagine dozens of voices stumbling over garbled text, laughing, then continuing anyway, because the melody was familiar enough to carry them through. In this way, monotony persisted, but absurdity crept in around the edges. You wander from stall to stall. One broadside praises a king's victory. Another mourns a shipwreck. Another warns of sin. Yet beneath the variety of subjects lies the same rhythm, the same recycled melodies, because people preferred to fit new words to old tunes. It was easier, cheaper, safer. Soon you notice that every song, no matter its theme, echoes another. A tragedy sounds like a love ballad. A hymn echoes a drinking song. The melodies blur until the entire market becomes one long refrain with different costumes. You stop by a group gathered around a stall where a blind singer performs directly from a broadside. His voice is clear, his memory unnecessary. The sheet before him dictates every word. The crowd sings along, their voices steady, their eyes on the text. The spontaneity of oral culture has been replaced by printed certainty. Yet the sameness has deepened. You can almost feel creativity shrinking, confined within the rigid borders of ink. As you listen, your thoughts drift to earlier scenes. You remember villagers humming nonsense, pilgrims parodying hymns, tavern girls twisting verses. Those improvisations, however clumsy, gave life to the songs. But here, printed words forbid such play. The audience clings to the sheet, afraid to stray from its authority. You sense that monotony has reached a new stage, institutionalized sameness, preserved in print, replicated endlessly without change. Still, the crowd is content. They nod, they clap, they purchase more sheets. For them, the sameness is stability. They can now take these songs home, sing them at their hearths, repeat them without fear of forgetting. The very boredom that numbs you may soothe them, providing predictability in a world where plague, war, and famine lurk nearby. The lantern light flickers, casting shadows across the printed pages. You imagine thousands of such sheets scattered across Europe, the same ballads echoing in 100 tongues, but frozen in identical form. You wonder whether the future of song lies not in inspiration, but in duplication. Historians still argue whether printing birthed cultural richness or cultural monotony. You feel the latter pressing heavy in your chest, yet humor finds its way even here. In the corner, a group of boys hold up a broadside upside down and sing nonsense syllables to the familiar tune, pretending to read. The crowd laughs, enjoying the parody. For a moment, the monotony breaks, replaced by play. But the joke relies on the repetition itself. Without the sameness of the broadside, the parody would collapse. Even rebellion feeds on boredom. The market begins to empty, sellers packing their stalls, lanterns dimming. You hold a sheet in your hand, the ink smearing, the words already dull. You fold it, slip it into your cloak, and step back onto the road. Behind you, voices still rise in chorus, reading from their pages, repeating the same refrains until the night swallows them whole. And you realize, as your footsteps echo into the dark, that monotony has now achieved permanence. Songs that once faded, mutated, or died are now trapped, immortal in their sameness. The age of print has given them new life, but it is a life without surprise. The road stretches onward, carrying you away from the market. Ahead, faint voices drift through the night again. Not joyful, not reverent, but restless. You sense that this time, the monotony has begun to crack. Audiences are no longer lulled or comforted. They are growing weary enough to rebel, to groan, even to demand silence instead of song. And that is where your path leads next, into the grumbling of a people too tired to endure another refrain. The road feels longer now, each step weighted with the sameness that has followed you from tavern to court, from church to market. You still carry the smudged broadside in your cloak, though you haven't unfolded it again. It seems almost unnecessary. The words already echo in your head, as though ink itself whispers in endless repetition. The night deepens, and soon you see the glow of firelight ahead. You approach cautiously, and there, clustered near a wooden inn, is a crowd gathered around a performer. But instead of applause, laughter, or the usual hum of accompaniment, you hear groans, sighs, and muttered complaints. You draw closer. A minstrel stands with his lute, strumming earnestly, his voice rising above the noise. Yet the song is one you know too well. It is the same nightly ballad, the same triumph, the same rhyme scheme. The performer sings with conviction, but the audience is no longer willing. Men shift on their stools, women roll their eyes, children whisper loudly. One man throws up his hands, muttering that he'd rather hear silence. Another bangs his mug on the table, demanding something new. The minstrel falters but presses on, trapped in his own repertoire. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Audiences in the later Middle Ages became increasingly vocal in their dissatisfaction with repetition. Records describe instances of villagers booing minstrels, demanding silence, or even chasing them away. Music had once been a treasured novelty, but as songs became too familiar, passed through guild halls, broadsides, and festivals, listeners grew restless. The very sameness that once soothed now provoked annoyance. You watch as the crowd grows bolder. A farmer interrupts the song with a mocking verse, twisting the lyrics into parody. Others laugh, clap, and urge him on. The minstrel grimaces but keeps strumming, trying to drown them out. A baker's wife calls out that she would prefer quiet, so she can hear the crackle of the fire. The innkeeper shrugs, indifferent. As long as ale is sold, the music is optional. The performer's voice cracks, and for the first time you realize you are witnessing not the triumph of monotony, but its collapse. Still, the rebellion is not complete. Some audience members sing along half-heartedly, unwilling to abandon the ritual entirely. Habits die slowly. But the mood is shifted. Where once monotony lulled, now it irritates. Historians still argue whether this change reflected broader cultural shifts, rising literacy, new entertainments, or the early stirrings of Renaissance creativity, or whether it was simply exhaustion after centuries of recycled ballads. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Audiences groaned. A quirky tidbit surfaces, lightening the tension. Chroniclers tell of one minstrel in Germany who, when faced with jeers, began deliberately singing worse, out of tune, off rhythm, and with absurd lyrics, until the crowd laughed so hard they paid him to stop. He turned failure into profit, discovering that boredom could be exploited with comedy. The more annoyed the audience, the greater the relief when silence returned. Perhaps silence was the most valuable performance of all. Back at the inn, you feel the energy of frustration ripple through the crowd. The minstrel stumbles through another verse, but the noise of the audience overwhelms him. People mutter about how they already know every word, how the ballad no longer carries meaning. You see a boy cover his ears dramatically, a gesture that earns laughter. the minstrel finally lowers his lute, muttering that perhaps the crowd does not deserve music tonight. A cheer goes up, not for the song, but for its absence. The inn grows louder with conversation, mugs clinking, chairs scraping. For once, silence between words feels more alive than the drone of recycled melody. You realize you are witnessing a turning point. For centuries, sameness had been tolerated, even cherished. Now, it provokes irritation. The shift is subtle, but important. Music, once ritual, is beginning to demand novelty to survive. Historians still argue whether this marked the decline of the minstrel tradition or the birth of new forms. Perhaps both. What is certain is that the audience no longer accepts monotony without complaint. Yet boredom still has its power. Later that night, as the crowd thins and only a few remain by the fire, one drunk man hums the same old tune softly to himself. He sways, eyes half shut, soothed by its familiarity. Another joins him, humming along. Soon a few voices rise together, and the ballad returns, not for performance, but for comfort. You smile faintly at the contradiction. The same song groaned at in public still survives in private, too ingrained to disappear. The fire crackles. Sparks drift upward, carrying with them the faint echoes of song. You lean back against the wall, listening to the tension between irritation and comfort, rebellion and habit. Perhaps monotony will never vanish. It will only shift between annoyance and balm, depending on the moment. Still, you sense that the rebellion will grow. Tonight, it is groans. Tomorrow, it might be silence demanded at the start. The next night, perhaps outright refusal to host performers at all. The age of the minstrel may be waning, pushed aside by audiences who crave something more, or by audiences who prefer nothing at all. The inn grows quieter as the last drinkers stumble to bed. The minstrel sits alone, tuning his lute mechanically, as if preparing for a performance no one will want. His shoulders slump, his eyes dull, but his hands continue their ritual. You feel both pity and inevitability. The sameness that once secured his living now erodes it. He is trapped in a cycle that his audience has begun to reject. You step outside, the cool night air washing over you. The village is dark, the streets silent except for the crunch of your boots. Behind you, faint humming still drifts from the inn, a reminder that monotony clings stubbornly, refusing to disappear completely. But ahead, you hear something different. Nonsense verses shouted in the distance, improvised rhymes filling the night air. It seems that, in the absence of patience for sameness, minstrels have turned to invention, not brilliance, but absurdity. And so your path carries you forward, into a world where boredom itself breeds nonsense, and repetition mutates into parody. The road winds out of the village, and the night hangs quiet for a while. Then, carried on the breeze, you hear laughter, raucous, unrestrained, the kind that spills out of bellies and shakes shoulders. You follow the sound, and soon see a cluster of people gathered around a makeshift stage set on the edge of a field. Torches flicker, casting long shadows over a handful of minstrels, who look less like performers and more like desperate improvisers. Their instruments are battered, their clothes patched, and their eyes gleam with mischief. You settle at the edge of the crowd, curious. The first minstrel steps forward, strumming a lute with strings that rattle like loose teeth. He launches into a ballad you recognize instantly. The same knight rescuing the same maiden from the same tower. But halfway through the verse, he forgets the rhyme. Rather than pause, he invents a line on the spot. Something absurd about the knight tripping over his own sword. The crowd erupts with laughter. The song collapses into nonsense, but no one minds. In fact, they cheer for more. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. When minstrels faced the impossibility of constant novelty, some turned to improvisation. Without reliable manuscripts, with audiences restless for change, they filled gaps with invented rhymes, jokes, or even gibberish. This was not artistry in the refined sense, but survival. Better nonsense than silence. And in many cases, nonsense proved more entertaining than the tired ballads themselves. The performance continues. Another minstrel joins in, twisting the story further, turning the brave knight into a bumbling fool who mistakes the maiden for a goat. The lute player cackles, strums louder, and adds a chorus of ba ba in place of forgotten words. The crowd nearly collapses from laughter. What should have been a heroic ballad has devolved into parody, and the people love it. You notice their faces glow brighter here than they did at the tavern or guild hall. Perhaps absurdity is the only antidote to monotony. Still, the nonsense grows tiresome quickly. The minstrel's inventions rely on surprise, but repetition dulls even surprise. By the third goat joke, the crowd's laughter fades into chuckles, then sighs. The performers scramble, tossing in new absurdities. The maiden now breathes fire. The knight now fights chickens instead of dragons. Some audience members groan, muttering that it was funnier the first time. The minstrels grin sheepishly, strumming faster, hoping momentum will mask the staleness. Here you see the tension clearly. Improvised nonsense can break monotony, but only briefly. Historians still argue whether this shift marked creativity or desperation, whether minstrels were pioneers of satire or simply fumbling through their own exhaustion. The truth likely lies between invention born not from genius, but from survival in the face of boredom. A quirky tidbit lingers in the chronicles. Some minstrels became famous not for their songs, but for their nonsense. One, known only as the babbler, was paid to recite strings of gibberish in rhythm. He spoke no recognizable language, only sounds that mimicked meaning, and yet crowds adored him for the novelty. His performances prove that sometimes the mere illusion of change was enough to captivate, at least until the illusion itself grew predictable. Back at the stage, the performance has spiraled. 3 minstrels now compete, each improvising wilder nonsense than the last. One sings of a knight who turns into a cabbage. Another invents a verse about a horse demanding better working conditions. The third strums the lute while humming gibberish syllables that sound suspiciously like a drunk man, arguing with himself. The crowd alternates between laughter and groans, delight and fatigue. Even nonsense, repeated, slides into monotony. You feel it too. At first, the absurdity made you grin, shaking you from the lull of sameness. But now, as the jokes pile up and the rhythm drones on, your eyelids grow heavy again. Monotony has returned, disguised in silliness. You realize that boredom is not defeated by nonsense. It only shifts its shape, reappearing as soon as the novelty wears thin. The minstrels bow dramatically, ending with a chorus of gibberish that makes the children howl. Coins clink into their hats, though more for amusement than admiration. The crowd disperses slowly, still chuckling. but already repeating the same jokes among themselves, wearing them thinner with each retelling. By the time you leave, you hear someone mutter that they hope tomorrow brings something better than goats and cabbages. You walk away, the torchlight fading behind you. The road is quiet again, though your mind still hums with the nonsense verses. They echo oddly, half comic, half weary. Perhaps nonsense offered a necessary release, a reminder that sameness could be mocked, even if not escaped. But you sense that this, too, cannot last. The audience's patience is wearing thin. Already their groans turn sharper, their demands for silence louder. Improvised nonsense may delay monotony, but it cannot defeat it. As you follow the moonlit road, you picture the future awaiting these minstrels. Some will vanish into obscurity, their nonsense forgotten. Others will cling to parody until even parody becomes dull. And gradually, the tradition itself will fade, replaced by quieter pastimes, by listeners who prefer silence to repetition, no matter how absurdly dressed. You pause on a small rise, gazing across the fields. The wind carries faint echoes of laughter from the festival you left behind. Mingled with the nonsense rhymes still clinging to your ears, you feel the weight of monotony pressing again. Inevitable, inescapable. Even invention cannot break its grip for long. And so you continue, weary but curious, toward the horizon where silence itself seems to wait. For after nonsense, after rebellion, after centuries of repetition, the end of the minstrel's world approaches. Their instruments will fall silent, their voices fade, and boredom itself will settle into the final echo. But before that silence, there remain a few more scenes to witness, a few more weary refrains to follow. The road stretches into darkness. Ahead, you hear faint strains of an instrument barely touched, its strings almost forgotten. You realize you are drawing close to the twilight of forgotten tools, instruments left without new songs to sustain them. Another layer of monotony awaits, heavier than nonsense, quieter than parody. And your steps carry you toward it, slowly, inevitably, as though boredom itself pulls you forward. The torchlit nonsense of the field fades behind you, leaving the road hushed beneath the pale spill of moonlight. The air is cooler here, sharper, and as you walk, the silence grows so complete that you begin to notice every crunch of gravel under your boots. Then, from the distance, comes a faint sound, thin, wavering, as though a voice of wood and string struggles to remember its purpose. You follow it, descending into a hollow where a handful of musicians gather around a dying fire. Their instruments rest on their laps like tired animals, and you sense immediately that you are among relics, the forgotten tools of a tradition running out of breath. A harp leans against a stump, one of its strings broken, the rest slack with age. A rebec lies across a minstrel's knees, its bow frayed, its sound faint and nasal. Beside him, a psaltery is plucked half-heartedly, its notes rattling more than ringing. The players do not look angry or even sibua. They look resigned. Their instruments, once central to their craft, have become little more than objects of habit. You sit quietly, letting the brittle tones drift around you. Here lies a mainstream historical fact. As musical tastes shifted in the later Middle Ages and early Renaissance, many instruments fell into obscurity. The rebec, for instance, gave way to the more versatile violin. The psaltery yielded to keyboards and lutes with broader ranges. Even the harp, once grand in halls and churches, was overshadowed by newer fashions. Instruments that had once carried communities into song now found themselves neglected, their repertoires stagnant, their voices fading. The minstrels here seemed to sense that fate. One plucks his harp with absent-minded fingers, repeating the same lull-like pattern until it feels less like music than a nervous tick. Another scrapes at the rebec, the same 3 notes circling endlessly. The psaltery player hums softly, adding a line of lyrics, though he forgets half the words. Together they produce not harmony, but a kind of weary murmur, the echo of songs that have already been sung too often. Historians still argue whether such instruments disappeared because of their limitations, or because the culture itself demanded fresh novelty that the old tools could not provide. Were these instruments inherently doomed by design, or were they victims of changing taste? Either way, what you hear tonight feels like a slow extinction, not with violence, but with monotony. And yet, a quirky tidbit lingers in the shadows of history. Some instruments were kept alive in rural corners, used not for high art, but for strange or local purposes. In parts of Northern Europe, rebecks were still brought out for harvest rituals, not to play melodies, but to mimic the creak of oxen carts or the drone of bees. They became instruments of atmosphere rather than artistry. You imagine a farmer scraping his bow, producing sounds that are not music at all, but reminders of work and season. Perhaps these minstrels before you are doing the same, using their tools not to enchant, but simply to exist, to fill silence with something vaguely familiar. The fire crackles, illuminating their faces. They do not smile. Their eyes are heavy, their hands mechanical. The notes they play are less performance than muscle memory, carried out because not playing would feel stranger still. You listen, lulled by the sameness, until even the imperfections begin to blend into a steady hum. The broken string, the squeaky bow, the rattling psaltery, they fuse into one long sigh of sound, soothing in its dullness. You notice, however, how little the few onlookers care. A pair of travelers sits nearby, heads bowed in sleep. A merchant leans against his pack, staring into the flames without reacting. A child kicks at the dirt, ignoring the instruments entirely. The music has ceased to command attention. It has become background, a habit that survives even when no one listens. And you feel the melancholy of it. These instruments, once vibrant, once capable of joy, now serve only as reminders of sameness. They are fading not because they have nothing left to give, but because no one asks them to give anything new. You wonder if, in centuries to come, their shapes will survive only in museums, their voices imagined rather than heard. The minstrels finish a phrase and let it trail off into silence. For a moment, the night feels sharper, more awake. Then, almost reluctantly, one begins again, repeating the same line, as if silence itself is more unbearable than monotony. The cycle resumes, and you realize you are listening to extinction in progress, instruments lingering in endless repetition, not dying suddenly, but fading slowly, note by weary note. The fire collapses into glowing coals. The players pack their instruments, though their movements are slow, unhurried. They know they will strum the same tired patterns tomorrow and the day after, until the strings finally snap and no one bothers to repair them. Their instruments are not companions anymore. They are burdens carried out of habit. You rise and leave the circle, the faint sounds fading behind you. The road stretches on, lit only by moonlight, your footsteps the only rhythm. Yet in the silence, you hear the echoes of forgotten instruments, their voices dull, their songs exhausted. It is not tragedy, not comedy, but something softer. The slow erasure of tools that no longer find purpose. And as you walk, you think of how sameness devours everything. Songs, performers, audiences, and now the very instruments themselves. It is the final stage of fatigue, when even the objects of music lose meaning. Ahead, faintly, you hear other voices, not the plucking of strings this time, but the murmur of foreign tongues, the echo of distant lands. You realize your path is carrying you outward, beyond one town or one culture, toward a horizon where sameness stretches across continents. In other lands, in other courts and caravans, the same weariness unfolds, echoing the same cycle of repetition and decay. And you know you must follow that echo to hear how far monotony spreads. The forgotten instruments fall away behind you, their echoes scattering into the fields like seeds that will never take root. The road bends, and your journey stretches further, past rivers that glimmer faintly beneath the moon, through forests where the wind itself hums with steady monotony. You walk until dawn, and when the sky blushes pale gold, you find yourself among strangers whose clothes, speech, and songs are not those of your homeland. Yet as you listen more closely, you discover that their music, though cloaked in different accents and instruments, carries the same fatigue, the same endless cycle of repetition. Sameness has crossed borders, seeping quietly into other lands. You arrive at a caravanserai, where merchants rest after long journeys. Camels kneel patiently, their bells jingling dully, while traders gather in shaded courtyards. A man strums a stringed instrument shaped differently from the lute, its body larger, its sound deeper. The melody at first seems exotic, its intervals unfamiliar, but soon you realize it tells the same story you have heard 100 times. A hero's bravery, a maiden's beauty, a journey's peril, a triumph foretold. The words differ, but the structure repeats, and by the second verse, you can already predict the refrain. Here is a mainstream historical fact. Music traveled widely along trade routes, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and wandering performers. Songs from one region inspired imitations in another, reshaped, but not reinvented. Stories of love, battle, and faith appeared again and again, their details altered to match local culture, but their bones unchanging. The result was both cultural exchange and cultural monotony, variety of surface, sameness of core. The traders clap politely, some nodding along, others distracted. A boy near the fountain yawns. One man whispers that he has heard the same ballad in 3 different cities, each time dressed in new words, but unchanged in spirit. You nod quietly, recognizing the same weariness you saw in taverns and guild halls. Historians still argue whether such sameness fostered unity across distant regions or stifled the unique voices of local traditions. To you, standing here, it feels like both, a shared boredom binding strangers together. And yet, quirks appear. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind from travelers' accounts. In some markets, foreign minstrels deliberately exaggerated exoticism, inserting nonsense syllables or invented foreign phrases to make their songs seem fresh. Audiences, unable to tell the difference, accepted the charade, believing they were hearing something profoundly new. In truth, the novelty was a disguise for the same tired refrains. Perhaps even now, as you listen to the deep strings in this courtyard, you are hearing borrowed nonsense dressed in dignity. You drift further along the road, passing into another court, where nobles recline on cushions, their garments bright with dyes unknown to your homeland. Here too musicians play, plucking at delicate instruments shaped like half-moons, striking small drums with precise rhythm. The scale is different, the cadence slower, but the theme repeats. A ruler praised, a land glorified, a people united by melody. The nobles nod with solemn approval, but you see one suppress a yawn. The performers bow deeply, but their eyes reveal no spark. Even here, far from the courts of Europe, monotony holds sway. As you sit quietly in the corner, lulled by the droning cadence, you think of how sameness survives translation, travel, and transformation. It is not bound to one culture or one tongue. It spreads like dust carried on the wind, settling in markets, palaces, and pilgrim roads alike. What seems new in one place is merely familiar in another. Even surprise is borrowed, recycled endlessly until it wears thin. The road carries you onward still. You pass nomads gathered beneath stars, their voices rising in song. Their instruments are crude, their rhythm repetitive, their verses filled with stories of ancestors and spirits. For a moment, you feel wonder at the strangeness of their tones. But soon the refrain repeats, again and again, until wonder fades into the same drowsy comfort. Even here, far from the churches and courts you left behind, monotony hums steadily. You lie back in the grass, the night sky vast above you, listening to the chant circle endlessly. The stars seem to echo it, shining in identical pulses. You realize monotony is not merely cultural. It is elemental. Humans cling to repetition because it reassures them. Songs repeat because life itself repeats. Birth, toil, rest, death. Perhaps you think, sameness was never meant to be broken. And yet, as the chant continues, you hear small fractures. A singer forgets a line and fills the silence with laughter. Another invents a verse about a camel stubbornly refusing to walk. The crowd chuckles, grateful for the break. Novelty emerges briefly, then is swallowed by the refrain once more. Even here, humor is the only rebellion monotony allows. Historians still argue whether these recurring patterns across lands prove a universal human tendency or the narrowness of medieval imagination. Did every culture independently find comfort in repetition? Or did the endless recycling spread contagiously along trade routes? The debate lingers, but for you, the answer matters less than the effect. No matter where you travel, the sameness follows. You walk on. The road stretches endlessly, winding through deserts and mountains, across bridges and valleys. Each stop brings new faces, new accents, new instruments, but the songs blur into one. A ballad of a king in one land echoes the ballad of a knight in another. A hymn to the divine in one city mirrors a chant in another. The instruments change shape, the costumes differ, but the music drones the same. A merchant walking beside you hums softly to himself. You recognize the melody at once, though his words are foreign. You hum along, startling him. Then both of you laugh at the realization that you know the same song, in different tongues. For a moment, the monotony feels like connection. Then the humor fades, replaced by the heavy awareness that novelty has vanished from the world. The journey stretches on, and you reach another settlement. Here, too, music swells in the square. Drums, flutes, voices. At first, the brightness excites you, but within minutes, the rhythms repeat, looping until they are indistinguishable from the chants you heard days ago. The sameness settles into your bones like dust. You wonder if the entire earth hums with one unending refrain, reshaped endlessly, but never reborn. Still, you feel yourself lulled. The monotony is wearying, yes, but it is also soothing. A cradle of sound that softens the edges of time. Perhaps this sameness, spreading across lands, is less curse than comfort. When the world is uncertain, when borders shift and wars rage, repetition becomes the thread binding humanity together. You pause on the road, gazing out across the horizon. The sky deepens, the stars reappear, and you hear faint music drifting from a distant camp. You know before you arrive that the song will be familiar, the story predictable, the refrain eternal. And you realize that this is the true fate of minstrels everywhere. Not glorious variety, but quiet sameness, spreading across borders until every voice hums the same weary tune. Yet you also sense the final act approaching. You have followed minstrels through taverns, courts, villages, pilgrim roads, guild halls, churches, festivals, marketplaces, and foreign lands. Their songs have dulled, their instruments faded, their audiences grown restless. Ahead lies the end, the final echo of monotony, the silence that replaces song when even repetition no longer satisfies. And so you take another step, slow and steady, into the night where the last refrain waits. Soon, you will hear the droning conclusion, the fading hum of a tradition that exhausted itself into stillness. The end of the minstrel's world is near, and you are almost there. The road narrows, and though history itself is funneling you toward its conclusion. The foreign camps and caravan songs fade into silence, leaving only the steady crunch of your boots on packed earth. Ahead, you see a small hill rising gently, crowned by the outline of a ruined hall. Its roof has long since caved in, its walls leaning, its windows hollow. Yet as you climb, faint sound drifts on the wind, the last lingering notes of a minstrel's lute. You step inside the ruin and find them, a handful of aged singers, their clothes threadbare, their instruments battered. They sit in a circle, strumming half-heartedly, voices trembling with age. The music is not beautiful, not stirring. It is weary, as though the songs themselves want to fade into silence. You watch quietly. One minstrel begins a ballad, but halfway through the verse, his voice falters. Another picks up where he left off, but she forgets the rhyme, filling the gap with a long hum. The lute misses notes, the harp buzzes, the drum thuds softly. They look at one another, not with frustration, but with resignation. This is all they know, and all they have left. For centuries, they repeated the same refrains until the world itself grew tired. Now, only echoes remain. A mainstream historical fact underscores this moment. By the 16th century, the traditional wandering minstrel had nearly vanished from Europe. Their place was taken by court musicians, printed songbooks, and emerging genres of Renaissance composition. The improvisers and repeaters of old songs had no role left to play. They dwindled into obscurity, their voices drowned by new instruments and new ideas. Yet fragments of their tradition lingered, ghost-like, in villages and memory. Still, the ruin feels alive with monotony. The minstrels here cling to sameness, not because they want to, but because silence terrifies them. They strum the same songs because there are no others. Historians still argue whether their disappearance was mourned or welcomed. Some claim they were beloved relics, others that people rejoiced when their droning finally ceased. Perhaps both are true. A quirky tidbit surfaces even now. In some towns, when the last minstrels faded, people hired imitators to mock them, exaggerating their repetition until crowds roared with laughter. Their legacy became parody, their tradition remembered as a joke rather than a treasure. You imagine the players in this ruin hearing such stories, knowing they are the butt of history's humor, yet too tired to care. The fire between them sputters, casting their faces in uneven light. You see lines etched deep from years of travel, eyes dulled by countless refrains. Yet there is peace here too. They do not fight the monotony anymore. They accept it, letting the sameness cradle them in their final years. Their voices merge into a slow chant, more hum than melody, more rhythm than song. It is a lullaby, not for an audience, but for themselves. You sit among them, letting the drone surround you. The ruin creaks in the wind. The night presses close, and the monotony becomes complete. No crowds cheer, no coins clink, no applause rises. Only the steady pulse of weary voices repeating themselves into nothingness. It is dull, it is heavy, but it is strangely comforting too. The cycle of sameness has reached its end, not with a burst, but with a sigh. And as you listen, your eyes drift shut. You realize that monotony, so often mocked, has served its quiet purpose all along. It lulled tavern drinkers, soothed pilgrims, filled courts, numbed villages, and carried voices across borders. In its repetition, it preserved memory, even as it dulled it. And now, in these final echoes, it rocks you gently toward silence. The ruin fades, and the voices drift into the distance, leaving you wrapped in quiet. The road no longer stretches ahead, for your journey has ended. You are still, surrounded by the faintest hum of all those refrains, layered upon one another until they blur into one soft tone. It is not a song anymore, not a story, only a vibration that rests against the edge of sleep. You breathe slower, deeper, each breath coring you thither from the bright torches and bustling crowds of the past. The sameness that once felt heavy now soothes you. It spreads around like a blanket, muffling the sharp edges of thought. You picture taverns where drinkers swayed, pilgrims chanting through dust, courts nodding politely, villagers humming nonsense, guild halls enforcing their lists, churches pressing chants into silence, festivals looping in endless circles, markets drowning in broadsides, foreign camps humming the same borrowed lines. And finally, the ruin where minstrels gave their last sigh. All of it has dissolved into one unbroken stream of repetition, a single lull. You rest within that lull now. The images grow softer, the voices quieter, until they are no longer history, but only echoes. You feel your body sink, the weight of the day loosening, the hum carrying you into darkness. The journey was long. The songs were endless. But their repetition has done what it was always meant to do. It has lulled you, softened you, guided you here. There is nothing left to follow, nothing left to hear. Only the quiet embrace of monotony itself. And as you drift, you know you are safe within it, rocked by sameness, carried by silence. Sleep comes gently,